Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of Starrcade 1989. Starting off the evening, we go to our first match of the night. It is Doom versus the Steiner Brothers in a tag team tournament matchup. Number one, I thought it was a good opening matchup for Starrcade 89. Back and forth matchup between Doom and the Steiner Brothers, with Doom keeping the pace of the match. But the Steiner Brothers ultimately get the win due to countout. Hats off to the Steiner Brothers for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Lex Luger versus Sting in a tournament match. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Lex and Sting, with Sting keeping the pace of the match. Lex and Sting both exchange in the middle of the ring. Lex then uses the ropes for a pin on Sting, pins for the three, referee didn't see it, and your winner of the match is Lex Luger. Hats off to Lex Luger for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Doom versus the Road Warriors in a tag team tournament matchup. Number one, I thought it was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Doom and the Road Warriors, with the Road Warriors keeping the pace of the match. And the Road Warriors ultimately hit the finish on Doom, pin them for the three, and your winners of the match are the Road Warriors. Hats off to the Road Warriors for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Ric Flair versus the Great Muta in another tournament matchup. I thought it was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Flair and Muta, with Flair keeping the pace of the match. Flair and Muta both exchange in the middle of the ring. Muta goes for a moonsault off the top rope, but Flair had his knees up. Flair then capitalizes on that, goes for a roll-up on the Great Muta, pins for the three, and your winner of the match is Ric Flair. Hats off to Ric Flair for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is the Road Warriors versus the Steiner Brothers in another tag team tournament matchup. Number one, I thought it was a good match. Back and forth matchup between the Road Warriors and the Steiner Brothers, with the Road Warriors keeping the pace of the match. Scott Steiner ends up hitting a belly-to-belly suplex for a near fall. Road Warriors then hit the finish on the Steiner Brothers. Animal then goes for a pin. Scott then had his shoulders up. Animal did not. Pins for the three, and your winners of the match, I should say, are the Steiner Brothers. Hats off to the Steiner Brothers for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is another tournament matchup. It is the Great Muta versus Sting. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Muta and Sting. Muta hits an elbow drop on Sting in the middle of the ring. Sting then gets up, hits a press slam on the Great Muta. Muta then hits a spin kick on Sting. Sting then was keeping the pace after that. Sting ends up hitting a superplex off the top rope on the Great Muta. Pins him for the three. And your winner of the match is Sting. Hats off to Sting for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is another tag team tournament matchup. It is Doom versus the Wild Samoans. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Doom and the Wild Samoans, with Doom keeping the pace of the match. Batu ends up hitting a headbutt on one of the Doom members. Pins for the three, and your winners of the match are the Wild Samoans. Hats off to the Wild Samoans for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is another tournament matchup. It is Ric Flair versus Lex Luger. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between Flair and Luger, with Flair landing devastating chops on Lex. Flair was keeping the pace of the match. Flair and Lex both exchange in the middle of the ring. Flair then applies a figure four leg lock on Lex. Referee sounds for the bell, and this match ends up ending in a time limit draw. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is the Wild Samoans versus the Steiner Brothers. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between the Wild Samoans and the Steiner Brothers, with the Steiner Brothers keeping the pace of the match. Scott ends up hitting a Frankensteiner on one of the Wild Samoans. Scott then throws one of the Wild Samoans over the top rope, and your winner of the match by disqualification is the Wild Samoans. Hats off to the Wild Samoans for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Lex Luger versus the Great Muta in another tournament matchup. Number one, I thought it was a good match. back and forth matchup between Luger and Muta, with Muta keeping the pace of the match. Muta was working on the legs of Lex Luger, like Lex had injured his legs earlier in the night. Lex then gets up, hits a power slam on Muta. Muta then sprays his signature green mist into the face of Lex Luger. Referee ends up seeing this, and your winner of the match due to disqualification is Lex Luger. Hats off to Lex Luger for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the Wild Samoans versus the Road Warriors in another tag team tournament matchup. Number one, I thought it was a good match. Back and forth matchup between the Wild Samoans and the Road Warriors, with the Road Warriors keeping the pace of the match. Hawk ends up hitting a clothesline off the top rope. Pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are the Road Warriors. Hats off to the Road Warriors for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Starrcade 1989. It is Ric Flair versus Sting. I thought this was a fantastic match. Back and forth matchup between Flair and Sting, with Flair, pretty much Sting keeping the pace of the match. Sting hits a press slam on Flair. Flair and Sting both exchange in the middle of the ring. Flair then goes for a figure 4 leg lock on Sting, but Sting counters it into a roll up. Pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Sting. After the match, though, you can see Ric Flair getting face to face with Sting. He's also greeted by the likes of Ole and Arn Anderson. Flair's pretty much congratulating Sting after the match. Then Arn Anderson's telling Sting to come over here. Arn Anderson grabs Sting's hand, puts his hand up, puts up the 4 Horsemen logo. The crowd goes absolutely crazy. It was an awesome time, man. It was a great match between Ric Flair and Sting. And honestly, Ric Flair, probably Ric Flair's biggest rivals throughout his professional wrestling career, man. As far as Starrcade 1989, man, what I got to say about it before I get out of here. Number one, I don't think it was the best Starrcade I've ever seen, in my honest opinion. On paper, there was a lot of relatively good matches on this card on paper, man. I mean, from Doom to the Steiner Brothers to Lex Luger versus Sting, the Great Muta versus Ric Flair, Great Muta versus Lex Luger. There's a lot of good matches on this card pretty much on paper. Now, match quality-wise and actually seeing it, it's a completely different story, man. I felt like a lot of these matches were very lackluster. As far as in-ring competition, man, I just feel like it, with the names of Ric Flair and Lex Luger and Sting and the Great Muta, I feel like they really didn't give you really good matches that I know these guys can give the fans. And maybe it was just me, maybe it's just my opinion, but I feel like some of these matches on here were very lackluster. And there were some that weren't. I mean, Flair versus Sting was really good. Luger versus Muta, it was a good match, but due to the fact that Luger injured his leg earlier on in the night, it was very lackluster, man. You couldn't give 110% out of Lex Luger. And to be honest with you, it's not just, me throwing shade on Lex Luger. I mean, these guys wrestled throughout the entire night. And I'm sure these guys were, exhausted by the end of the night because they had so many matches leading up to the main event. But match quality-wise, it was just really lackluster. And like I said, man, this definitely was not the best Starrcade I've ever seen. It definitely wasn't the worst, but it definitely was not the best Starrcade I've ever seen by a mile. It wasn't there for me personally as a fan. You know what I mean? It just wasn't. Like I said, on paper, matches were awesome, but as far as seeing it and reviewing it, it just wasn't. It wasn't there, man. It just wasn't. As far as giving Starrcade 1989 a rating from 1 out of 10, I'll have to give it maybe a solid 4.5, man, at best, because, like I said, on paper the matches were awesome, but as far as watching the matches and see what actually went down, it was very lackluster, to be honest with you, in my honest opinion, man. So I'm going to have to give, Starrcade 1989 a solid 4 at best. But this is my review of Starrcade 1989. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.